Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So it's with my great pleasure to invite Devika Subramaniam. Devika is a professor from Rice. She hails from Stanford, and before that, IIT Kharagpur. And she's one of the most passionate and friendly professors you'll ever come across. Today she'll be talking about embedded systems for learning. And I don't think there's anyone that's going to be able to change education with as much ability as she can. So I really hope folks take advantage of both her presentation and the time she's here. Thank you, Devika.
Thanks, John. It's an honor and privilege to be here. Thanks for inviting me, John. Today's presentation titled Adaptive Embedded Systems, and all these words mean so many different things to so many different people. So I'll spend the first few minutes talking about the context, and then I'm going to show you 4 projects that I'm currently involved in, which will sort of elaborate on the points I want to make with adaptive embedded systems. So I want to begin with learning. Part of it is that's where I spent most of my time. So when I graduated from Stanford, my thesis was really in the area of machine learning. And machine learning is a vibrant, exciting field. It started in the late 70s with Tom Mitchell's thesis, 79, and then really mushroomed in the late 80s and 90s with the development of brand new algorithms like reinforcement learning, support vector machines, Bayesian classifiers. And a lot of it has even been built into products such as, the paperclip guy, my favorite illustration of an embedded system. It sort of highlights what's hard about doing a good job, and also sort of what the advantages might be of having technologies like that. But when people study learning algorithms, they tend to look at it pretty abstractly. So you have some prior knowledge, you have training data, and you generate predictive models. So lots and lots of theories that tell you, given training data, how to make predictive models. That's all fine and good, and there's at least 25 years worth of work that's out there. If all these algorithms are known, how come everything you use on an everyday basis isn't adaptive at all? So while there's tons of systems, there are very few adaptive systems, and each one seems to require a significant amount of effort to make. I'm interested in embedding learning into just about everything that we make. So my inspiration for that is actually from the political arena. So Herbert Hoover had this presidential campaign slogan, a chicken in every pot. Well, I won't tell you about the second part of it, which is a car in every garage, which I think is bad for humankind. So just the chicken in every pot, that's the one I'm going to stick with. Well, why don't we put learning in every piece of software that we're going to have? That should be our slogan, and that's my slogan. I think it's worthwhile. I'll try to motivate that. And I think if we make the design of systems with learning embedded in the very design process, we're going to come up with a superior class of things to interact with. I always tell my students, we're constantly adapting to our machines. When are they going to adapt to us? And so that's what I want to make happen. So when people think about embedded systems, it could be anything. It could be your editor. It could be your car that's learning your driving patterns. It could be anything. It could be a hardware system or hardware-software system. Doesn't really matter. Embedded in some environment, the system takes actions, and the system observes the environment in one form or another. There's this tight feedback loop with the environment. And when I want to study learning, I want it built in, so to speak, into the system itself. And so the cartoon I had from before, the predictive models are not just models for someone to ooh and ah over, but rather things that actually have an influence in the way you choose your actions. So you calculate decisions on the basis of learned models of systems. That's the point. So when a designer makes a system for solving a particular task in an environment, he makes assumptions. But once those assumptions fail, to hold, the system just does poorly. This is the real purpose for embedding learning, so that you can have freedom, and you could have the environment drift, change, and still have systems that calculate reasonable responses. So that's the whole point. You can always calculate decisions on the basis of learned models of systems. So don't build in everything. Leave the system the ability to observe and do what it needs to do. So an example from the corporate world where this philosophy has been taken to heart is actually Walmart. They don't ask their managers to say, well, what should we buy? Should we, stock up on drinking water or whatever? They just observe the environment by looking at the checkouts, what people are buying, and then they have prior knowledge about some correlations maybe, and all their decisions are then made on the basis of actual observation. I think this is how every system ought to work, and this will yield more robust systems. At least that's the idea. I've already made some of these points. Why embed learning? The reason is we simply cannot calculate and implement a strategy for every sort of situation at design time. So you've got to let room for adaptation. System dynamics may be completely unknown or partially known. System dynamics change with time, so you can't just build one thing. My favorite example with this one is actually elevator design. When Otis makes elevators, they actually use models of traffic patterns in the building. Of course, if it's a brand new building, they only have a speculative model. And they build these elevator systems for that model. But once the building is actually fielded, and the traffic patterns are not like the models that they had used to make the elevator scheduling algorithm, then they have an expensive retrofitting problem because they have to come in and actually, it should be inside they should have built the elevator scheduler with the room to observe and modify its behavior. They don't do that, though I believe there's a company in Japan that's working on those adaptive elevators. And finally, the reason you want to embed learning in any system is a one-size-fits-all solution may not be appropriate. Customization may be needed. And so then you have to observe and change on the basis of who's using you. Lots of research questions if you want to study embedded learning. A lot of the theoretical work in learning assumes that the modeling problem is solved. What's the modeling problem? What aspects of the task, the environment, and the system dynamics do you need to observe and model for decision making? This is the hard part. This is the part that, every learning paper begins with, let S be the state space. Hello? No system I've seen has walked up to me and said, here I am, here's my state space. Just figuring that out is hard. So then, learning. Well, what should you learn? Usually there are so many things you could learn, but only some that you should learn. And there's no guidance from theory for how to do that. So I think this calls for a new kind of theory, motivated by adaptive systems, And finally, so you have models, but models are not, have a job to do. They have to change your decision making or positively affect your decision making, particularly in environments with scarce resources and changing environments. And I know there's a huge group here at Microsoft Research that works on precisely these problems. So I wish I could say there's a stack of theory for handling all of this, but 25 years worth of learning hasn't yielded fantastic answers for any of these. So what is to be done? Well, this sort of makes the same point. There is no basic science of adaptive embedded systems. I think we have pieces, but no integrated theory that tells us how to go about designing an adaptive embedded system. So what we've got are, a few successful examples, a few not so very successful examples, and very little understanding of precisely what the difference is between ones that succeed and ones that don't. That's what I want to change. A lot of my prior work, I'm sorry to say, had this character. The beauty of this is that it's only of theoretical importance, and there's no way it can be of any practical use whatsoever. A lot of the work in theoretical machine learning, including my own, fit this mold. I think we need to stop that. And how can we move forward in the design of such adaptive, in building a science of adaptive embedded systems? You need to design and validate algorithms for large-scale real-world applications. Now, I'm in the academic world, and I have only access to a few of them, so I'll share with you 4 of my experiences. But I think we can do what I will show you in a few moments on, systems of other scale. I have a new test for when your theory is any good. Before, the test is, well, can you get it published in your area? So in my area, it would be, can you publish it in Journal of Machine Learning Research or Journal of AI Research or the AI Journal or the ML Journal? I think wrong. I mean, your work will get published there. That's the easy part. The hard part is to convince the real-world application people and publish in their journals. If they accept it, then come back and tell your community, look, here's how to do this. This is the path I've followed for the last 8 years. It's a hard path. I wish to God I would say, oh, this is trivial, this is a fast way to fame and fortune. It ain't. But I still have had a tremendous amount of fun doing this. And I think I've come away with an appreciation for what's required to make the science of adaptive embedded systems. Because underneath it all, I'm still that pointy-headed scientist. But my early training as an engineer is the one where I draw upon all the time. And quite frankly, it's been the most fun doing that. So here's the roadmap of my talk. I'll get through as many as I can get through within the time I have. They're really, I've modeled them as 4 case studies, and I'll draw lessons from them. So here they are. The first 2 belong to the same category. We have an unknown system we're dealing with, and what's worse, the dynamics of that system change. We know that. How it changes, I don't know. So it's tracking human learning on a complex visual motor task, a task I got into thanks to the Navy. It was funded by the Office of Naval Research. The second is predicting the evolution of international conflict. And just as a teaser, let me tell you, the problem there is the following. Can you read news media reports over an extended period of time and build a model of how conflict evolves in different regions of the world? Using just that as your observations, can you build a predictive model of conflict? Well, maybe the answer is you can't, but the NSF thought my ideas were interesting enough to fund it. I'll show you where we are on that project. It's actually one I spend most of my time on. It's a very, very interesting problem. Because what it tells you is, and you know, what it tells you is perhaps there's enough information in the public media if you only know where to look and how to process it. Finally, we've looked at unknown systems where you need customization. And there are 2 kinds. Because of our proximity to the MD Anderson Cancer Center, Rice is right across the street from there, I've been working with oncologists trying to understand how metabolic processes are disrupted in cancer cells. Now, cancer is a very individual disease, even though we have so few treatment options. I mean, treatment options are pretty much of the heavy cudgel variety. But, you know, I've been looking at prostate cancer. And prostate cancer is so individual. I mean, exactly what happens, what's disrupted in each person is different. So even getting an understanding of what's really disturbed might give you a plan for how to attack that particular cancer. So prostate cancer is really a label for a huge number of things. And if we can start to tease them out with observations, then we can. And now we have amazing new ways of observing cells in action. So that's an embedded system. We have a way of observing it. Can we modify its behavior at the cellular level? Because we now have the modalities to look at what's happening. And finally, because I am from Rice, where compilers are king, I figured if you can't beat them, just join them. So designing customized compiler optimization sequences for application programs. So here's the intuition behind it. I would like to build compilers with whom you can have the following conversation. Compiler, compile me this application and make sure my application code will run with this amount of resources. It could be space, time, energy, whatever. And do this, and compile this for me in 10 hours, or whatever time you've got. Then you walk away, and if it's 10 hours, you probably go home. If it's 20 minutes, you run down the hall and get a cup of coffee, and it comes back and it says, are you serious? You're going to give me 10 hours to do this? No, I'm going to need 2 weeks. So you have this negotiated, you know, conversation with your compiler. Well, you can have this is not possible in today's compilers, because compilers are not adaptive in that sense. Well, what do you need to do to compiler design to enable these conversations to happen? That's what this is about. So I don't know if this is an interactive thing, but if there are any questions right now, I'll stop and take them from the audience. Okay. So let me quickly introduce you to this task. This is tracking human learning, but the task arises in the following manner. So this is Submarine School 101, as the slide says. So people who go on to become submarine commanders go through about 2 years of training in submarine school. And submarine school is like what engineering school used to be, which is a weed-out program. They take in a lot more people than they intend to keep, and they progressively throw them out. So this is one of the early games, and what you have is you have to drive a pilot a submarine to a goal, to a rendezvous point, in a limited amount of time. You're embedded in a minefield, and all the information you have is revealed through sonars, 7 sonars, and they have a 20-degree forward cone. So it like spans a 140-degree forward field of view, only to a particular distance. You have a compass that gives you the bearing to the goal, and of course this tells you how much time you've got left, and this gives you the range to the goal. Actions are communicated via a joystick. So you observe this. So as I was saying just before the talk began, my 8-year-old can play this quite well. Now I have been working on this task for at least 8 years, and I've never won a game. But I write programs that play this game, so I guess that's my revenge. What's interesting about this game, so this is a slightly speeded up version of this game. Each game is 30 seconds, and the mines are relayed at every point. So you can't just remember a sequence of moves and win this game. You really have to have a strategy for playing the game. But merely having a strategy is not enough. You have to be able to execute the strategy. You have to persuade your eyes and your hands to do your brain's bidding, as it were. So you have to train your visual motor loop to play this. It's a difficult game because the Navy gets rid of 50% by this method. So it's a pretty effective screen. So the reason they brought me in was they thought, well, are we throwing out the right half, which is a good question to ask. At anything that's this effective, you want to know whether you're keeping the right chunk of people. And more importantly, they wanted to understand, what is this game measuring, really? I mean, sometimes you have puzzles, but you don't know what it's really selecting for. So I got into this because I wanted to understand if I can train machines to play the game under the same conditions as humans, because I can open up a machine's brain and kind of see what it has acquired and perhaps use that as a basis of understanding, what's being learned. Now, the game that you just saw before, it's a 2D minefield, and the path traced by that person was just the one that I showed you here. So, of course, if you see this view of the game, this is a trivial view, right? I mean, there's no problem. This is just a simple a path planning problem. What makes this hard is that you have only incomplete information, and you only see so far ahead with the sonars. The sonars are noisy just to make things really interesting. Okay? So the game has both a strategic and a visual motor component. Here are 5 subjects that we looked at. We've looked at many more. I mean, all told, we have about 50 subjects, but I just put up 5 here for you to see. Clearly, you can see 3 people learning, getting the task, and 2 people who seem, unable to learn. These were Rice students. And you can see that all the successful ones, in fact, all the ones who actually end up learning, you see the learning curve, there's a rise, a plateau, a rise, a plateau. And there are some who just sort of level off at a certain point. Since I collected the data for this particular purple subject, I can tell you the purple subject had set an internal goal for herself at 60%. So when she got there, it was amazing that she could just tell her system to stop learning. She said, 60%, I'm done, and stayed there. What's interesting is I've never seen humans achieve more than 80% on this game. And the Navy standard is they train you for 500 episodes. So they put you in front of this game for 500 trials, and at the end you get 10 games to play. If you get 8 out of 10, you're in, otherwise you're not. So by that measure, only one person would have made the cut here.
But your daughter would make it right away.
Hallelujah. Yes, she would. She would have gotten the 8 out of 10. So, unsuccessful learners. Successful learners look similar. Unsuccessful learners, by this measure, just look bad. I mean, they're like DOA. So here are the questions. Is the game hard? I think there's evidence that it is. But why is it hard? What's the source of complexity? Why do humans plateau out at 80%? Is that a feature of the human learning system, or is it a feature of the game? Can machine learners achieve higher levels of competence? Finally, can we understand why humans learn or fail to learn the task? And can we detect the inability to learn early enough to intervene? Because the Navy now needs 5 days to tell whether you're one of those flatliners or whether you're going to be a success? And can we actively shape human learning on this task? This is the question that excites me the most because I might finally be able to learn the game, without having to write programs to play it. So that's what the rest of the talk of this module is about, answering these questions and showing you how sort of we can, using principles of embedded learning, actually answer these very specific task questions. Yes, John?
Can someone succeed at the game just by having incredibly fast reflexes?
No. In fact, we've taken subsamples of populations, people with lots of video game experience.
Yeah.
They had no advantage on this game.
People that play things like Go and chess, they have an advantage.
We haven't studied them. So we only did the experiment with so we haven't collected a subsample with the Go or chess. So we've only looked at the visual motor side. So that's a good test to do.
Does your daughter play Go or chess?
She's starting to play chess, but she's 8.
But do you see that she's able to strategize?
Perhaps. But as you will find on this game, articulating strategy is very hard. So we did a lot of work in the beginning trying to understand what strategies people were using. In fact, people like Chris out here helped me actually code up strategies that people would say they were using. But when we would code that up, that's not how they played. So when you replay their games and you replay their coded strategies, they had nothing to do with one another. So one of the difficulties about analyzing this game is that people do not have introspective access to what they're doing. So it's very hard to train. It's intuitive, yes. Right. This is a complicated game, I can tell you that. And so we're only beginning to understand sources of the complexity and the knobs to turn to accelerate learning. So naturally, you want to understand what this task is about. So I'm motivated by task questions. So the rest of this is sort of how do we answer those questions? So it wasn't, I want to develop a brand new cool embedded learning algorithm. It was, how do I answer those questions? And then everything follows from there. This task, the NRL task, happens to be a member of a family of tasks which are partially observable Markov processes. But fortunately, you can make them fully observable by state augmentation. This is a well-known trick for converting partially observable Markov processes to fully observable ones. Unfortunately, the state space gets really, really huge. And what's sort of frightening about this game is the number of choice of actions you have at each step. You have a choice of 17 discrete turns and 9 speeds. In fact, we use a special joystick to play this game, in which only 153 action choices are encoded. So if you think about it, you're in a state, you have 153 choices in front of you, and the average game, well, maximum you can go is 200 steps because that's when time runs out. And on average, there are 80 steps. So you make 100 in a space of 153, the branching factor is 153, 80 to 200 moves down, they tell you, you made it or you lost. So this is a tough game, clearly.
Would it be easier if we provided Xbox controllers?
I knew that was coming. Well, I think what I'm going to show you is a facility you can offer your Xbox players because they can watch their visual systems and their brain systems at work. And that would be a kind of feedback you can give them so they can modify the way they play the game. So I wanted to understand if machines can learn the game. So because I promised the Navy when I first got this grant that I can easily get machines to learn the game. I told them tops 1 year. At the end, I'll come and make you a grand presentation. So I used reinforcement learning, actually, the well-known reinforcement learning. Off the shelf, I figured, well, this is ideally suited for it. The state is visible. You get feedback. Of course, it's at the end. And, you have one choice of 153 actions at each point. Well, my first attempts at doing this failed miserably. 100,000 games later, the machine was winning 1 game in 100,000. This was not good. Your average human, well, your good average humans, were doing, 80% after 500 games. Clearly, they were abstracting the state space in some unknown way in order to be able to manage the complexity. Finally, we did get machines to learn. And I'll show you how we did that. This is a quick, I'm not going to spend time on the Q-learning algorithm, but that's the algorithm we used. Lots of hurdles. State and action spaces had to be manageably small. You need good intermediate feedback in the form of a non-deceptive progress function. So first you have to, this is the modeling that I talked about. How do you take the task and pummel it down to size so that you can actually solve it? In this, I had tremendous help from several resourceful undergraduates. One of them, Scott Griffin, who came into my office as a freshman, bored because he'd finished all his homework and didn't have much to do. So I said, well, here's this game. Why don't you go build a player for it? He came back 2 weeks later with a player that was 90%. It won 9 out of 10 games. That blew my mind. And so he and I sat down for he had a huge, at that time, the language in vogue was C++, a huge C++ program. We pummeled it down to 5 lines by carefully removing everything. At the end of it, we discovered a state space representation that was just, in hindsight, the obvious one. But hindsight is always 20/20, and I'll show you that. And we found a great way to define a progress function that will speed up learning on the task. I'll show you that. There were algorithmic hurdles. Q learning, very expensive, very slow. So this is the point again. Let me reaffirm the point that you might have an off-the-shelf learning algorithm, but it's designed by someone who hasn't thought about the cost of running that algorithm. If you're going to use it in an embedded context, you've got to worry about the cost. So you may not be able to run that full version of the algorithm. You need sort of the diet version of the algorithm, the light version of the algorithm. And so I'll show you Q-learning light that actually enables a machine to learn this task. So that's what I'm going to show you quickly. Here's the state space design. I can pummel it down to 768 states from 10 to the 14. How do I do that? On each sonar, I only look at is it bigger than 50 or less than 50. So right away, I get 2 to the 7. I ignore everything but sonar and bearings. I can play this game with only the bearing, the compass information, and the sonar. And I divide the bearing into the equivalence classes that I've shown. Also discretize the actions so that the space becomes smaller than the 153. That's pretty much the 5 lines of code, honestly, because once you discover there are only 768 states, even those can be categorized into basically 5 equivalence classes. So every line of code tested essentially conditions on these 2, and there were 5 conditions. It took us 8 months to get that, but we got there. So that's the point I want to make. The reason people, including myself, wrote those theoretical machine learning papers was we didn't have to do the hard work of getting down, pummeling down the state space. There's very little science to guide us there. The reward function, the reward in the original game is at the end. When you make all these moves and then it says, yay, you made it. Or, oops, you hit a mime. Or, oops, you ran out of time. But this one actually, so this has the red part is the stuff the game gives you. And this is the stuff that we added. So we actually reward you if you go from a blocked state to an unblocked state. So if you just, increase the openness of the field, we reward you. We tell you that's a good action. If you are in a block state and you move from a block state to a block state, we look at whether the difference in the sum of the sonars. We look at whether you're actually making progress. So we define a new way of defining local progress. And this one actually decides whether you're still heading pretty much in the direction of the goal. So it rewards you for keeping to a path that's more or less along the goal. So the actual constants are not that important. We've played with a whole variety of them. But having these 3 steps in the reward function, very important. Even the credit assignment policy, which is a big deal in reinforcement learning. We have 2 kinds of failures in this game. One in which you lose the submarine because it exploded, and one in which you timed out. So we penalize the last action alone in a sequence which, so you might have been playing darn well, but then you make a misstep and the submarine blows up. You shouldn't penalize the entire history, just that one action that got you in trouble. But when you time out, it means all those actions must be penalized because somehow it was the fault of the whole sequence.
So if at the end you hit a mine, it's over?
It's over. You start over. Correct. Absolutely. Now, the standard Q-learning algorithm will update what's called the Q value of a state, which is the expected sum of rewards from a state S to the terminal state. And the Q function kind of incrementally updates that. This is the update equation. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to really run this full version of it. Why? Because the distance from a state to the terminal state could be as many as 200. And if you're waiting for these terminal rewards to bubble back up to the state, you're going to wait a whole long time. So we use a cheap approximation. It's so cheap, I was afraid of putting it on the slide. Keep a running average of the rewards, the local rewards you get at S, and then you multiply it by how often S was on a winning sequence, which is very cheap to keep. And that's your surrogate for the full Q, which is done using approximate dynamic programming. But you don't have the resources to do approximate dynamic programming. And we do extremely well. So the blue curve is one in which we only learn the turns. Because we have the, thanks to Scott Griffin, we had the near optimal player. So we would feed the speeds and have the machine only learn the turns. And that's the blue curve up there. So in 100,000 episodes, it's really losing about 1 or 2 games. It's amazing. And the red curve is one in which it learns both turn and speed. So we don't give it a crutch. So one thing it tells you is, if you want humans to learn the game, you can give them the speed and have them learn turn, because just learning turn is easier. It's very clear to see from this. The other thing is, at the end of 500 episodes, the red learner, the one that learns speed and turn just like humans do, only is at 10%. A good human is at 80%. So what this tells me is that humans make much more effective use of examples than Q-learning. So Q-learning is not kind of optimal. However, this is Q-lite. Remember that Q-full doesn't even work on this game, so it's not that we have a reasonable comparison to make. The Q-lite doesn't really make the most effective use. So that's, I think, raises new research question. What should we do now with that? So here's how it plays, by the way. After 1,500, after 10,000. Unfortunately, it can even fail after 10,000. Why? Because it can encounter states that are not really, remember we pummeled the state space. It can encounter states that it hasn't really, a combination of states that hasn't really seen, that hasn't really trained for, even after 10,000.
Were you able to win?
No. See, my visual motor loop, I didn't waste my youth on video games, the loss. So
So what is it about you that doesn't let you win the game, do you think?
I think I cannot take a strategy, the joystick and the visual motor loop. So I'm better at Sudoku, where the visual motor loop is not that important. Yes, so absolutely. So I'll speed up now because I realize I'm running out of time. Mostly we figured out why learning takes so long. Why does the Q learner need 100,000 episodes to get this good? I mean, look at the scale on this. That's just 10,000 actually. If you go to 100,000, you really lose only 1 or 2 games. Do you really need these many trials to get there? It turns out you do. Because, and so this was the startling thing that we managed to find out about this game, and we realized that success on this game was not a property, it's a property of the game, not the property of the human visual system. There are states where this is sort of the states that you observe, of the 768 states, we look at the frequency of occurrence. So there's an equivalence class of states that only you see 7 times sorry, state number 7, so it's like 2% of the time. But these are critical states. You have to learn the right action here. So if you're not exposed to that enough, you're not going to know what to do there. And the game dynamics are such that you're not going to see it very often. So you're going to need a whole lot of games before you see them. So how can we get humans to achieve 100%? The answer is obvious. Rewire the mind layer so that this becomes very frequent. So now we've cracked the game. We know now how to make humans play, the ones who can, that is, play really, really well, and within a space of 500 games, really acquire it at 100% level rather than the 80% level. And you need a threshold on the motor skills to be able to do it. But at least strategically, we can get them to do it.
So there might be a really strong business relevance to this, because what you're defining isn't just what makes somebody more successful at the game, but what makes the game more fun.
Yes.
You can then codify that and then offer that to the game company saying,
Yes.
this is the sort of thing that would make the game more fun. That's sort of the thing people are looking for when they invest millions of dollars.
I think we can take this, the work I've done here, and put it to another game, and where the objective is the fun coefficient. I never had to articulate. I mean, all you need is some feedback. When people are having fun, you want some kind of feedback from that. Here, the feedback was your submarine was blowing up or something like that, and that's all we needed to jumpstart this process. So for machine learning, we figured out why the game is hard. We used a cheap approximation of a well-known algorithm in order to make machine learn it. Staging learning makes tasks easier, so now we know how to help humans who are having difficulty. And obviously, we had to define a new progress function to speed up training. There's no reason to suggest we can't give it to humans so that they can learn the game better. So we got to the first two questions, and now we want to understand why humans learn or fail to learn the task. What is it that separates people who do from people who don't? And can we detect the inability to learn early enough? For this, I'll put a little cartoon. Here's what we did. We built another embedded learning algorithm that looks at humans playing the game. So we put eye trackers on humans, so we know what they're looking at. We wire their joysticks, and we actually make predictive models of how they're playing so we can intervene in the learning. This is very hard to do. Part of it is the visual data is, very large, 11 dimensions, spanning a huge space, large volumes of data, noise in the data, and policies change over time. There's non-stationarity. So here is how a person would behave close to the mines. See this large green thing? Close to the mines, early during training, people actually freeze into inaction. So the most common action is speed 0, turn 0. Later on, see this green thing has fallen down and people are making turns, and they consistently prefer one turn over the other. This is very important in this game, because what often happens early during learning is people will oscillate. They'll come, they're surrounded by mines, they go a little bit to the left and they go a little bit to the right, and so they're just oscillating in place, as opposed to turning consistently, trying to find a way out of the minefield. And here, you see that they have learned that strategy.
That particular skill seems like it would be improved by playing first-person shooters.
Yes, totally, because, yes. So here's how we designed our embedded learner. We first tried to talk to people to understand whether they're using high-level abstractions of the game, and to try to build models that use their abstractions. But as Chris will attest, if he only remembered.
I think that was Scott.
Oh, it was Scott. Okay.
The little robot following the walls.
Oh, yeah, right. Thanks for reminding me. You get to be my age.
Yeah.
Scott. It was Scott who did that, yes. We tried to actually interview people after the game and say, well, how do you play the game? What's the strategy you're using? That didn't work at all. So instead we said, we're going to look at their low-level visual motor data. We're not going to talk to you at all. We're just going to unobtrusively gather data from you and use that to build a model. We decided to make cheap models. These are first-order Markov models. They're just lookup tables mapping the sensor panel to the action distribution you took at that time. Because the same sensor panel may appear at multiple times, so you collect an action distribution. What was the number of times you chose one action or the other? And finally, for our decision making, using this model of how a person plays the game, we compute a derivative of those policies over time. So over a certain window of time, we collect a lookup table that maps the sensor panel to the action distribution they took. We take another window next to it and compute the same table. We found a way of taking a derivative of it, and we found a way to do it very, very fast. So we can actually classify learners and select interventions, and we actually use them also to build behaviorally equivalent models of subjects. Well, when I showed this to the ONR before I actually went and built this, they said this is not going to work. Didn't you say there were 10 to the 14 sensor configurations? The lookup table is going to be 10 to the 14? And you're talking about, doing this fast and cheap? But here's what saves us. In actual up, when you actually construct them, there are only 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 4 of these configurations that occur during gameplay. And that's what we use. We basically exploit sparsity in sensor configuration to build a direct model. This was unknown to us. And through the course of this work, we discovered something that was quite interesting. We didn't need to build models at all. We could look at the size of the lookup table and predict whether these guys were going to make it or not. That was astonishing. People who were good players had short lookup tables. People who were lousy had long lookup tables. Why? Because they would wander into states they shouldn't have if they were playing the game right, which was interesting. So that was a zeroth order model that would tell us. So there are unexpected surprises when you start to think about actual games. Because it's highly non-stationary. See, a person's way of playing the game changes over time. So you want to really capture where those changes occur. So we have to segment that data stream in a way that captures that. So here's what I said. We build a lookup table over one window of another, and it's slightly overlapping. We actually, the window sizes for people who care, it's 20 and 5. Overlap of 5. Here's what you get. The red curve here represents a learning curve of one of our subjects, and the success rate is here. The blue curve is the strategy derivative curve. What you're seeing is, you see it's highly peaked. Each peak corresponds to when there's a dramatic shift in the way the person played the game, to the left and to the right. Several things to note about this. Every successful learner looks like this. So this is just one example. The other, you'll notice that, there's a certain spacing between these peaks, and then of course the peaks die out, and yet the performance improves. This is skill refinement. So this is strategy acquisition followed by skill refinement. It's very abrupt. That surprised us because we thought initially that it would be this gradual process of getting better. But people stick with the strategy, run with it, find it isn't working, dump it, adopt a new one, go with that. It's a very, very discrete process. That was shocking to us. We hadn't expected that at all. And I'll show you the implications of this. Just to show you, see this little peak over here? I'm going to show you a game right over here on this side, another one on the other side. Just show you how dramatic the difference is. And obviously I won't show you the instrument view because God knows who can decode that. So here's our subject. It was an easy game, but see how slow and tentative he is. Our windows are size 20, so we can only look at stuff. He has a plan. He knows what he's doing. Very different kind of play. Here is, remember the purple subject who was kind of DOA on the learning curve a few moments ago? This is her strategy derivative curve. You notice that she hasn't really fixated on a strategy. More importantly, she's just been changing strategies like nobody's business. She hasn't let it, look at the spacing between her peaks. So this is a person who's smart enough to have that many ideas. It's cool. But doesn't understand that there is an impedance match with her visual motor system. So we'd intervene in this person. I mean, if you look at the value of the KL derivative, it's as high as 1.8. It's really very high. This is in bits. It's very high. So radically different strategies adopted, lots of peaks. This is an individual that the Navy ought to pull out and get them to slow down between ideas, or allow the ideas to soak through their visual motor loop before trying another one. But clearly someone creative enough that they shouldn't be dumped out with another person for whom basically, and I'll show you very soon, for which it's a flatliner. See, so you get a flat line on the learning curve, a flat line on the blue KL derivative curve, you're out of the pool.
So you were talking earlier that coding up people's articulations of the strategies were failures.
Yes.
So all of this is subconscious strategy generation?
No.
They're consciously saying, I'm going to change strategies now?
No, it's all obviously subconscious, but we're detecting it. That's the point. So they do not know. I mean, this person's probably not even aware she's doing that. But if you give this feedback to her while she's playing the game, and we generate these curves in real time, so we can imagine having a small portion of the display showing her derivative curve, and she could probably, like biofeedback, say, you know what? I should probably slow my brain down because it's just working too hard.
If you go back to the previous example, what about the What about the, sorry, the previous animation?
Yes.
What about the chance that the person has found an exploit? Now, I would argue that if you go to either border area,
Yeah.
you limit the amount of potential choices you have to make because everything to the left doesn't count. So then you only have things to the right. And if that's not the way it would be in the ocean. Well, it might be.
True, true. Well, the thing is, the way the minds, they really change. So using this strategy is not always a win. That's the longer path, by the way.
Borders never change. If you always go to the north or south, you always limit your possibilities.
You do, but here is the problem. You will lose by timing out. Because these paths, so he was lucky here in that he was able to find a path. More often than not, this is actually a terrible strategy. And the only reason I showed you this was just to tell you that he got lucky, and B, that he's playing with a whole different approach, it seems, than the one before. Right. The moves are no longer tentative, as it was before. So, in fact, arguably this is terrible. Yeah. And he would not know that he was actually, most people who play the game never learn this aspect, because we never show them this. So, often when you ask them, draw me the minefield, you do not get anything that looks like this. So, this is all subconscious, as it were. Yes. And get, exactly. So we figured out, at least on this game, how humans learn. And it would not have been possible unless we decided to embed computation and marry it with the observations we were getting. Because when I got into this project, cognitive scientists were studying people learning the task and building R and SOAR models. This was a whole different approach. So why not let the data speak and build computations that will tell you what's going on? Subjects have relatively static periods of action policy choice punctuated by radical shifts, and successful learners have conceptual shifts during the first part of training, and unsuccessful ones have trouble till the end. We also use these to generate what I'll call behaviorally equivalent models. So what we do is, remember the lookup table I talked about? That's really a compression of someone's strategy. We're going to use that as a proxy for the subject. So here's the experiment we ran. We looked at 4 days worth of data. That's 400 games of a subject. And we built models out of that. And we let the model and the subject play the 5th day. And I'll show you the first 10 episodes out of the subject playing those 10 games and the model. So in the next few things, you're going to see the subject to one side and the model built out of the subject from the past 4 days. The same experience as the subject. And you'll see we're able to actually get a fairly good grasp of what the subject is doing. That was astonishingly close. You almost might think I've cheated by putting the same video on both, but I haven't. Here's one more. It's remarkable how close. They're not identical, as you'll note, but the paths are more or less the same. So we have canned the subject now, so we can replay him anytime we like, because the lookup tables are a perfectly good approximation of the subject. It was jaw-dropping when we did this, because all of the statistics I had calculated then showed amazingly good fits, but until we actually started to replay the games, we didn't realize how amazing they were. But there are failures. I don't want you to think that it's all perfect. We're not at 100%. The subject manages to get out of the bind. The model doesn't. And sometimes it's the other way around. The model got through. The subject lost his way.
So if you had somebody designing minefields as another game,
yes,
and then tossed him over the wall to these folks,
yes,
I don't believe anybody designing the minefields would know whether they're computer-generated adversary
yeah.
actual rights.
They wouldn't. That's the point. We passed the Turing test, so to speak, on them. Question.
But with the human, you can still be reciprocative for motor skills, where in computer it's never reflected.
It is reflected. So remember, we're building stochastic models, right? We have action distributions. So that's how we're able to model the motor aspect. Otherwise, you're right. Remember, this is not the computer playing the game. The computer is playing the game with the subject's model. So So we build a predictive model of the subject, and we are running that predictive model. And so that's what is being shown here, and this is the actual subject. And really, it's like, I don't know if you're around during the campaign, is it live or is it Memorex? I mean, that's the question you would ask here. The graph I would have shown you is sort of, that's the subject's behavior on the 5th day. And we match it pretty close. And those 10 episodes that I showed you were just a fraction from the first 10 where you can see the fit is particularly good. So we can model subjects on this task in real time. The Navy was very pleased with it because, they had invested about 10 years worth of money with the cognitive scientists trying to do this. And it's probably one of the first in cognitive science to directly use objective visual motor performance data to derive these high-level strategy models on a complex task. Yes?
So to your earlier point where real success for this would be to publish in the Chemistry Journal.
I'll show you that.
And then have it later published in an academic journal. This seems incredibly relevant to you guys doing game design.
Yes, but actually I published it in the cognitive science world because I figured that they are the community to show this to say that there are new methods of doing the task that they're doing. And, by the grace of superior beings, I actually got published in there, which amazed me because I expected them to come after me with that. So, but that was not the only thing. We built fast new algorithms for detecting change points in high-dimensional, data, and building predictive stochastic models for these non-stationary vector time series data. And I showed you before new approximations to speed up convergence of reinforcement learning. So, some of my more theoretically minded friends might say, oh, Devika, she's gone nuts because now she's doing all this engineering stuff. But I find that engineering problems are often the inspiration for brand new theory results. I would have never thought of this approximation to reinforcement learning unless, literally a gun pointed to my face going, speed this up so we can match humans. I mean, that was the inspiration for it. So right now, my current direction on this project, maybe I'll just talk about this project and end, because I realize now I should have scheduled a 5-hour talk here. But the current direction is, are there neural correlates to the strategy shifts observed in the visual motor data? So one thing what worried me is, were all these artifactual things, maybe it's not real at all. Maybe it was just, the glitch, numerical glitch in our algorithms. It's possible. Can we, if in fact there is a shift in your visual motor system, then it should be visible upstream. Can we detect it upstream is the question. And so, with a collaborator out at the University of Houston who has this 256-channel EEG, we now have our subjects, and you'll see the setup in a moment. It's actually not too bad. I can imagine people wearing these caps. It takes a while to get on because you've got to lubricate these leads and stick them in your head. And you've got to go wash your hair at the end of this because you have this icky goo on your hair. But small price to pay for science. So here's the question. Can we adapt training protocols by identifying whether subjects are struggling with the strategy formulation or visual motor control or both? And finally, can we use analysis of the EEG data gathered during learning, along with the rest of it, to correlate brain events with the visual motor events that I think we're detecting? And can this correlation separate subjects with different learning difficulties? This was the motivation. As always with every project, I have some task questions I want to answer, and all the theoretical stuff, mathematical stuff comes in the service of these task questions. I know I'm belaboring this point, but I want to be very clear that that's sort of what motivates me. Actually, the Navy said, oh, we'll give you a better version of this task. And so it has the same dynamics. It just looks nicer and easier to recruit students to come play the game than the old one. So that's always a good thing. Yeah, enhanced it and gave it back to me. So actually, this is more difficult than the game I showed you before, because in this one, the submarine actually has momentum, which it didn't have before. And this is the version I know I don't have a chance in hell of winning. So it's on my laptop, so if anyone wants to play this game to see.
Is this available to folks to download?
I can give you. Yeah, I don't think this was open source, so I can actually put that out and have people play. They actually got 2 guys at San Diego State. I had a cognitive science collaborator on the project just to keep me cognitively honest. And her students actually developed this version for the Navy. They went over to the Navy guys and worked with them to build a realistic simulation. It's actually a very cool game. This is our current setup. So you sit down, You have that funny cap on. You're playing the game. We're recording everything you see and do. And this is a huge screen showing your EEG waves. What we do with the EEG data is something very, very crude. Remember that all of this, we want to be able to intervene in real time. So we can't sort of take your EEG data, mull over it for a month, and come back and tell you everything you need to know. It has to be done in real time. So we use actually a very coarse measure. It's called coherence. And what it does is it measures essentially the correlation between different channels, okay, of EEG. And it essentially measures synchronous activity between two brain areas. So the function we use is called coherence, computed by, MATLAB, for example. It actually calculates a normalized cross-power spectrum, so for different frequencies. So this F is different frequency bands. The bands we consider are the usual ones considered in EEG work: the delta band, the theta band, the alpha band, the beta band, and the gamma band. And we're often interested in the gamma band because the gamma band is the seat of all higher level cognitive processing. And what we do is we compute correlation between all of the different 256 channels at all of these different frequencies, and we bundle up the frequencies as shown, and we draw a line between two of those nodes, two of the channels, if the correlation is higher than 0.6. So what I'm going to show you is a topological coherence map that looks like this. These are the different channels. This is the back of the head. This is the front of the head. This is where all the cognitive processing, the high-level strategy stuff is happening. This is the back of the head where all the visual stuff is happening. And then there's the motor areas, which are here and here. And for a right-handed person, it's over there. Okay? This can be built very, very quickly. So as the EEG is being collected, we can get this immediately. So here's what we do. We record the EEG, we get the motor data, we get the visual data, and we compute the coherence map, which is that's what it's called, that stuff. We also compute the learning curve and the strategy curve, as I showed you before. We're going to correlate all these three pieces of information and see what we gather. So here's a subject for whom the learning curve, actually this scale only goes out to 0.45. Okay, so this is not a particularly good learner. He just had a bunch of wins over here and a bunch of wins over here. That's it. And if you look at the strategy curve, it has 1, 2, maybe 3 peaks, and then he kind of peters out. So if you just looked at this, you'd say, this guy isn't doing a whole lot. Doesn't look like he's even trying. And here is the real-time map of what's happening in his brain. You'll notice that nothing much is happening in his head either. So this is a guy we'll pull out of the protocol and say, you know what? This is suggestive evidence that you're not working a whole lot, but this is the clinching piece of evidence that tells me you're not really trying. Very little frontal activity. So we know this is a guy who should be thrown out. So he's having difficulty. Either he's not motivated, which is very likely, or he just has no idea what to do. Contrast him with this guy. This subject, his learning curve, not good. He played 170 games and won 2 games. So his learning curve is pretty much a flatliner. His scale curve indicates that he's struggling. At least he's trying.
So he's treating this like a physical video game.
Yes. Yes. Oh, no, wait, let me show the animation, because we do this over time. So actually, this is how we collect all of this data in time, and now you can see. He's working hard, and you can see whenever you have connections from the front to the back, that's when there's crosstalk between the strategic system and the visual motor system. And he's switching strategies a lot, as you can see. You wouldn't accuse this guy of not working hard. Right. But even though their learning curves look the same, from their strategy curve and the EEG coherence map information, we can tell this person has not learned a good strategy. We should pull him out and actually give him hints toward a good strategy and put him back. Well, how does an expert do? So this guy, this was actually a graduate student who was visiting my lab, and I told him, oh, you got about an hour, and he said, sure, and so he was willing to subject himself to this experiment. He actually plays a lot of first-person shooter games. He has a lot of experience. And when we we collected data on him. He only played 50 games. To collect a full complement of 150 games would be about 3 hours, and he didn't have that time. His learning curve, you'll see, I mean, he got to 80%. I mean, you know, this is an unsmoothed version of the curve. If you look at his KLD curve, there's not much activity. It's sort of fairly smooth, fairly flat, no peaks, no distinguished peaks. And when we ran it through the EEG machine simultaneously, notice that there is frontal activity. You can see the nose is the marker for it. And occasionally you'll see this downloading of the strategy into the back. But otherwise, he's pretty much figured out the game. So he's only in the skill refinement. So we can classify now on the basis of the density of connections in the front, the density of connections in the back as well as the side, depending on whether you're left or right, and the density of connections back and forth. So we build simple classifiers that tell you which of these 3 types of learners you are. And you can do this in real time. That's great. There are distinct EEG coherence map signatures associated with different learning difficulties, lack of strategy or shifting between too many strategies. And the coherence maps of these successful learners show shifts from dense to sparse synchrony. And it's really the indicative of shifts from the strategy formulation to the strategy retrieval. Because once you are in the refinement phase, all the activity is happening only in the back. We have 12 subjects so far, and so these are just 3 I picked out. But this summer, we're actually doing a massive push to increase it to 50, which is sort of the norm for these kinds of studies. Yes, a week. That is true. There's tremendous individual variation on this task, and there's also variation kind of, mood specific. So we try to, of day specific. We try to give them the same experience each time, but sometimes we've aborted trials because, and have them come back the following day because they're simply not performing. And usually subjects are aware of that. They say, oh, I can win more games than that. And so, say, oh, I didn't sleep last night. So we say, okay, go back and come back the next day. So, but we try to collect them in blocks of 50 because it's a fairly intense game. And after 50, you really get tired. So you'll see drop-offs. This is why if you want to collect about 150 games, you have to come back 3 days in a row. Yeah. The effect that you're talking about is something I'd like to explore, which is there's a well-documented effect in psychology, which is the, basketball players do this, where they actually visualize the moves they're going to make. Tennis players, golfers. So their limbs don't move, but the areas of the motor and the visual motor system are activated. And so people who take fMRI images see all those parts light up. But clearly these guys are sleeping maybe, or a state of sleep, kind of, or alpha mode or whatever. And they are in the hands are not moving, but the brain is doing that. I don't know to what effect that has on this game. But the way I see this work being useful is, take your Xbox, for example, all kinds of games on there. What about providing, using methods such as these, feedback on how you're playing the game and having the subject alter their playing strategy on the basis of this level of feedback? So that's something to think about. I just read I don't know if you get the New York Times, but yesterday I was reading this article where this is an experiment being conducted at Stanford for modulating pain circuitry. So they do an fMRI imaging. So you lie in this fMRI machine. The thing about my method is you don't need a $3 million machine. This is so cheap that anybody can afford it. You can probably bundle it with your Xbox controller, and send it out. But the fMRI machine, you lie down, and they actually show the chunks of your brain that are active. And then from the background, though I've been in an fMRI machine, it's very noisy. I don't know how they give you instructions through that, but let's imagine they do it. And they tell them, now pretend the pain is like a walk in the beach, and they can see so it's like biofeedback, where the people are able to visualize just how their brain is working and modulate that. So I can see people getting better at playing games. But my vision, though, is actually not to use this for games, even though it seems like a fun thing to do. I really think if tools such as this become available for K through 12 education, and so if teachers can diagnose learning problems, why can my kid not add as well or read as well as the next one? Or then you can begin to see patterns of activation. and then perhaps use different interventional strategies for the different patterns. Now that we have all these new modalities for observing our brain at work, why not put it to use at the lowest ends?
But the challenge is there is, like, for example, in this particular case,
Yeah.
maybe determine this is what qualifies you to a candidate.
Right.
That good candidate is mapped to this game.
Yes.
If you pass the game, that's
Then you, yes. So there's a clear, no, I think, well, I wouldn't, I'm not saying this because I think it's a good test, but in Texas there is a test. It's called the TAX test that everyone takes. So that is your minimum standard. You know, you pass a grade if you're able to pass the TAX test at the end. So there is a criterion. Of course, educators debate its goodness, but every state, thanks to the No Child Left Behind, it's mandated now. So at least in K through 12 education, we have a standard, however poor that might be. No, it's federal now. I mean, they call it different things. The reason I know is because, you know, I'm in Texas and I have an 8-year-old who has to take them. Yeah. So, but your point is well taken when there's a well-defined criterion. But for any task, I think, you know, how are you ever going to have a sense of for the person who makes a task often has a sense of what qualifies as good performance on it. Very rarely do we make tasks where we say, well, do whatever with it. I mean, rarely. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's very rare.
We go through another feedback process, and as we devise the test,
Yes.
we observe that, we're not getting that many great candidates.
And then you revise the test, yeah. But that's possible too. I mean, you know, you run them through this another task, maybe not this one, and then you find you've lost 80% of your population. And this happens in admissions committees where we say, oh, we're only going to take GRE scores of, you know, 1,000 and above, or whatever the number is. And then you say, oops, our pool just emptied. And then we go and revise it down. Yes, absolutely. That was a moment of levity. And as promised, you know, we publish in the biomedical as well as the cognitive science world.
But you started the presentation strenuously arguing that captive industrial pyramid was rather than academic.
Yeah, I don't know them. I mean, so cognitive science was a community that was actively involved in this problem. So I figured, so as an academic, I reached out to the academic community that was presumably specialized for solving that problem, and telling them that the generalists, the computer scientists, had a way of approaching their problem that could make an impact. I agree with you. I think I need to reach down and get, go to the game developers conferences and sort of show them this work and see how we can push that further. I'm up for that. But and SIGSI, yes. This was the first year that I went to SIGSI thanks to you. I mean, otherwise I would not have attended that at all. I mean, it's unfortunate. SIGSI gets such a mixed review in the academic community, and then you almost reflexively stay away from it because, you know, sometimes you say, oh, you know, someone tells you, oh, it's not made it really easy. So, yeah, and I had a great time there. So I said, oh, I should go to them. Actually, the PhD students I train go to SIGSI. And one of them had come down to Houston, and he said, I don't know why I don't see you there. He's been telling me this for years. I tell him, SIGSI, are you going to get tenure if you publish there? Is what I've been telling him. But I stand corrected. You know, I'm always willing to learn. So, I don't know. Maybe in 10 minutes I can tell you about international conflict if anyone's interested. Or we can stop. Your choice.
I'm very interested, but I have to for the rest of the day, and I can ask about that later. So I'll leave it up to the crowd.
I'm all in favor of it.
Okay, I'll try to keep it 10 minutes so you can still get lunch. How's that? I knew I prepared too much. I knew that when my slide count got to 150. So, but as Chris knows, once you get me going, you can't stop me. So, anyway, back to our usual model of embedded learning. Here, I want to learn about the world. And what do I want to learn about the world? The particular thing is, where is the next conflict going to break out? And by conflict, let me, I've been working on this with a political science collaborator, Professor Stoll at Rice. He's a well-known international relations specialist. And he works on precisely these problems. That is, figuring out models of conflict, how do conflicts evolve. His particular specialty is the Cold War. So he's been studying models of the Cold War for a long period of time. So I had the following idea, why not base your models on actual data? This is sort of the theme in everything I do. Instead of asking people how they learn stuff, actually look at what they do and figure it out. Instead of asking when conflict is going to break out, actually look at what's happening in that region over an extended period of time and see if you can figure out if conflict is going to break out there. And I should sort of use conflict with the little c, which is what I have there, and conflict with the big C, right? So certain conflicts, like wars, they're very rare. And those are pretty chaotic, unpredictable. But there's a category of conflicts that are called militarized interstate disputes. And that's when two countries decide to settle their disputes by actually a show of force. Yes?
So this professor that you referred to,
yes.
is he a model conflict expert?
Yes, he is.
And so some of his sources, you consider the sources.
He looks at wire news. He does it, but he's integrating it as a human. I'm asking other algorithms that can help him, better yet, not replace him because he's not replaceable. You see what I mean? I think a lot of important policy decisions happen with information that's gathered from a large number of places and aggregated, sometimes incorrectly. And so high-level decisions are often not based on actual grounded data. I figured wire news that reports on actual events, and I'll spend you a few moments telling you what I mean by events. They're not opinions of events, they're actual events, will help you make much more accurate predictions of when conflict will break out. This is, until now, only a theory. We're going to test that out, and I'll show you what happens with it.
Are you familiar with the work in Columbia with Marilyn Bright's job on the news feeder?
Yes, we use ideas from there, but that only helps us in aggregating the news. But then you've got to work with it, make the events, extract events out of it, and then make the predictive model. So there are at least two more. So we use a lot of work, and you'll see that. You'll see references to it as I. So this is the question, the task question. As always, I'll give you the task question. Can you monitor news media from all over the world and extract low-level events from them? You'll see what that is, and piece them together to automatically track and predict conflict in regions in the world. So here's what we've got, actually. We troll. So this is where we use some of the work from Columbia for aggregating the news, online information sources. We've actually restricted ourselves to AP, AFP, BBC, and Reuters. Reuters costs a lot of money, so we only get the free channel, which isn't as much. And we have a huge Microsoft SQL server, actually. Now we have over 1 million articles on the Middle East from 1979 to 2005. We could have more, and you'll see we have a fairly tight restriction on what constitutes an article of interest. Otherwise, we could get much more than 1 million. But we really only store articles that we think are useful. As you see that in a moment. We have an event data extractor. I'm going to show how that works. And we post-process that in interesting ways to make models. And so that's what the rest of this talk, which will go very fast, is. Well, I'll skip this. That's what you're going to see all that. Well, the first problem we run into is identifying relevant stories. A lot of stories, even in the wire news, are interpretations of events or are events not about conflict. So you've got to have a filter that pulls them all out. I allocated one summer to do this problem. Big mistake. Unsolved problem even today. The best we can do, precision 86%, recall 81%. Okay. Ideally, for this task, you need high 90s for this. Oh, hi, Brooke. We actually use the Microsoft server's Okapi classifier, and we use it in an innovative way, I think, to build things that do much better than the standard naive Bayes models. That shocked and surprised us because, your DSpam and all the other spam filters use naive Bayes. We found a cool way to use the Okapi. So all of our filtering is done through SQL queries, and you'll see that. We have a labeled set of 180,000 stories from Reuters. Surprisingly difficult. Problem is lack of large labeled data sets. Poor transfer to other sources. This was very surprising. When you learn to classify stories of interest for Reuters, you haven't solved the problem for AP or BBC. There's so much variation in styles, in writing styles, and choice of words The classifiers that work in one that are word-based won't work on the other. So it's terrible. And the category of event-containing stories is not well separated from others, and it changes with time, obviously. So these are the challenges. So our best results are up there, 93 and 87. Here's how we use the Okapi classifier. We build a representative set of articles we like and articles we don't. When a new article comes around, we compute the Okapi distance to each of these. And here's our decision rule. Sum of the top n is 25, by the way, the magic number. Okapi stories in relevant set bigger than the sum of the top 25 Okapi stories in the relevant set classifies relevant. This works extremely well. This is cheap, fast, we can do it online, which is what we do. Okay. The next step. So, okay, we found a story that we think is interesting, where we can get something out of it. Here's an example. And by the way, gone are the days when event wire stories were these rat-a-tat kind, X did that to that. No, no, no. Look at that. This is an example from Reuters. President Bill Clinton said on Monday the United States sought no confrontation with Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, but declined to say whether that meant he would forego immediate airstrikes on Iraq. This is your example sentence, the first line of a story. You've got to extract what in political science are called events. And so here are the events you would extract. There are graduate students who spend 2 years in political science of their graduate career reading wire news stories and converting them into these codes. So they can only look at, for 2 years, you just read wire stories each day and do this conversion. This is the problem I want to automate to the extent possible. It seems ripe for automation, but I'll show you kind of the difficulties there. From this part so we actually have a way of taking the sentence and breaking up into fragments, such as this. Each fragment is sort of one thought, if you will. We use the Stanford parser to look at the structure of the sentence and separate it into components. The first one, President Bill Clinton said something. So we pull out, so there is the political scientists have event categories, right? There are 22 event categories, and you've got to classify each of these. Who did what to whom? So who and whom are countries, which you have to pick up from the sentence, and these are one of 22 things. That's the classification problem. So you have USA making a comment on the USA, USA denying something with respect to Iraq, and USA making another comment with USA. And because this is in the kind of future tense, would forego, no event has actually occurred, you kind of say, well, there's no event to extract from here. This is a difficult problem. So I'll skip through this. We look at the parsers. There are rules for pulling it all out. We use conditional random fields to extract out actors and targets and events. We have a long way to go. This is a project in progress. I'll show you where we are right now. State-of-the-art coder. So people in political science have been thinking about automating this process. They haven't done very well, by the way. So the state-of-the-art coder is something called Tabari, which has an accuracy of about 22%, a recall of 7, and a precision of 50. So we can definitely do a whole lot better with our CRF models. This is for 2 of the categories. 22 is the category where you have a force category, which is bomb or some highly conflictual activity. A comment is the most common category. So for these 2 classes, we do reasonably well. We can definitely do better. We're training our CRF models to be able to extract these much more reliably. Long way to go. Long way to go before we can release this.
You analyze news right now better than PhD political science?
Better than first-year students, but not as good as the second-year ones. The reason is the following. Often, what really trips us up, by the way, are news articles that assume a lot of context that the machine simply doesn't have. So often you might have a story that talks about a conflict but doesn't name the parties. And so you have to know, it's the coalition forces versus Iraq or something like that, and that may not be mentioned in the story. Oh, yeah. We collecting training data for this is extremely painful. So our largest sentence corpus is only 200 sentences because the political scientists hate to, because you have to annotate everything, So to produce these detailed example bases is so hard. So what we now have is and I can give you a demo at the end, we have set up an interface where essentially the machine gives its most likely coding, and we have them correct it. That's a much better way of getting information from them than saying, tell me ab initio what this is. So we're now collecting more data out of them. But to train CRF models, the conditional random field models, for example, requires tremendous amount of data. And I'm looking for help in that. So if there's any interest here in that kind of processing, let me know, because we're short of hands on that problem. So at the end of the day, you get these events data. They look like this. Here's the date. Here's the actor, the target. What was the event? It's actually the first two digits define the event category. 22 and 3 is a modification. And all events have a corresponding numerical score between -10 to +10, a scale of conflict, which is -10 to cooperation, +10. So you send a trade delegation over to another country, that's a +10. You bomb them, that's a -10, and everything in between. There are 177,336 events that were actually derived, I would say, by hand, honestly, out of the people in Kansas University of Kansas invested 10 years and untold amount of graduate labor to get that done. So it's a huge data set that's available. We want to mechanize this. This is what we want to do, to be able to do this in production mode. But as I say, with accuracies like, 89% ain't good enough to do that. We still have to have humans to curate it. We have to get it in the mid-90s before we're ready to release it. And each percentage point is a lot of work. So the low-hanging fruit have been picked off. Okay, the 80% was easy. 80 to 89, the climb was very hard, and every subsequent point is going to kill you. So here's what we do. We take this data, we chunk it into 2-week intervals, okay? And we compute a composite score, which is simply the average. Okay, so you take this data, sort it by date, divide it into 2-week intervals, and that's the plot of it on the top. That's the heartbeat of the Middle East, as I like to say. And you can see it's a pretty conflictual place because the average on that red curve on the top is in the negatives. So we can actually get a lot out of that signal, as it turned out. I thought, well, we've aggregated the information down, right? We extracted the events. We now take away all of the actor and targets, only look at the actual event scores, which are -10 to +10, take the average. And so every point there represents a 2-week period. There are 579 of them, or 597 of them. So when we ran this through a simple segmenter based on wavelets, we found, this is using a technique called Malat's modulus minima technique. Essentially, it identifies discontinuities in that signal. So from where I'm looking, it says, well, it's discontinuous all the way. But actually, it isn't. Each of these is a major conflict in the Middle East. The start of the Iran-Iraq War, the end of the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, the first Intifada. I forget this one. These are actually elements of the second Intifada, 2 of them. If I pull out these discontinuities by removing those points artificially from the data, I start to get the lesser conflicts. They come out. So I can really reverse read the history of this place, the conflicts, by this.
Have you given the student the project of taking this, combining it with putting calls on oil commodities to see whether or not they make money?
Yes, this has been suggested to me. I presented this to a colleague at CMU, and he said, well, we need to get you hooked up with this data so we can do that. Yes, definitely. I think the price of oil would be highly relevant, or commodities, as you say. We can do analysis like that because that data also comes, it's this continuous signal aggregated like this and overlaid on top of this, so we can put another level. I haven't done that yet. The reason is my hands are pretty full, as you can see. There's plenty to do on this problem, but that's something that is in the back of my head, a few more hands. The other thing that we're doing is we're looking at this and building these interaction graphs. After all, if you've got events data, you can build this graph, right? Where you have an arrow between 2 countries, if there was a red one, for example, for conflictual and blue for something nice, and they're all directed graphs. Can we analyze these graphs and the evolution of these graphs to predict conflict? Short answer, yes. We use the hubs and authorities algorithm. This is the PageRank, a variation on the PageRank algorithm for Google. And here are the two hypotheses we have substantiated. In the interest of time, I'll just tell you the hypotheses. If you identify hubs and authorities over a particular temporal chunk of events, it tells you who the bullies and the bullied are with 100% accuracy. That's not surprising. You actually have the event data. But what's surprising is, by looking at the changes in the number and size of connected components in the interaction graph, you can actually understand when significant conflict might break out. So let me show you what the interaction graph looked like just before, 2 weeks before the outbreak of Desert Storm, to give you an intuition for why this is the case. So Desert Storm is that first war that the elder Bush fought with Iraq. Notice that, well, first off, you can see who the key players are by just following the thick edges, right? Kuwait, USA, Iraq, and the UN. And the other players, Israel, and actually, surprisingly smaller player is the United Kingdom over there. Right? So now you can believe that looking at this, you can tell. I mean, you don't need amazing.
So it looks like United Kingdom and Japan
have equal weight, which is surprising. The other thing you will notice is you can find paths, which is very connected graph. The only guys not in the loop are Australia, New Zealand, and let me see what that last one is. Oh, Lord. It's some small, Senegal. Sorry. Right. Senegal, New Zealand, and Australia are out, but the whole world has conglomerated into one big chunk. This is a signature before the eruption of major conflict, is all of these countries come together. If you look at the connected components in the graph, usually when the world is a happy place, there are 8, 9, 10 components. But 2 weeks prior to conflict, they seem to glom up. And this makes perfect sense to my political science collaborator. He says, of course, when you are when something bad's brewing, everyone picks sides. So you will observe this aggregation effect. But what's interesting is you can see this in some conflicts as early as 4 weeks ahead. So in the case of the Iran-Iraq, sorry, not Iran-Iraq, but this particular war, Desert Storm, you could have seen it 4 weeks ago. And the United States did not have a 4-week notice on this. I'm talking about the event that actually precipitated the war, which was the takeover of Kuwait, not the actual invasion, because once Kuwait was taken over, then the United States was put in a position where it had to kind of make good on the threat that take over Kuwait and we'll kill you. We had to go and take care of that.
It seems like there'd be interesting subtlety between this graph and the similar graph for the second Iraq.
The second one does not look anything like this. Absolutely. That is the focus of a project that I'm doing jointly with him to try to understand the build-up to war number 2 and war number 1 using tools such as this. We made a preliminary presentation at the, again, following my philosophy of publishing in the top political science conference. So this work is getting a lot of attention there. I'm hoping to migrate that now into the computer science world and show that the tools we work on actually are very helpful in looking at the world around us. So computational tools can actually give us insight into phenomena that we are immersed in. Yes?
So in the political arena, would you consider economic events also a bigger issue? Because if you consider that, then
I think that will add a lot more constraint to the problem. Right now, we've only looked at political events. Part of the reason is that the political scientists have spent 20 years perfecting a method for classifying political events. So when you saw the event categorization, I said there are 22 categorizations. Now, we need to find a way to think about economic events so we can divide them into a bunch of discrete categories. And then the same analysis, except we overlay all of this. Right now, we can only look at price changes, for example, or an embargo, or how do you code all that, right? So there isn't a coding scheme. And the reason we're able to get such nice analyses out is, again, a modeling problem. You see, the political scientists have solved our modeling problem. And so if you want to do the analysis that John mentioned a minute ago, and which is, and you were sort of suggesting the next version of it, I would really need that modeling problem solved. So I need to get an economist on the team to help me do this. But that's in the cards. I mean, that's where I'd like to go. So I'm not there yet. Anyway. Sorry. Lester Thoreau. Yes, right, right, of course. Anyway, in the interest of time, I'll have to stop right now. There's some fantastic stuff on learning individual models of cancer, how cancer cells behave in different prostate cancer patients, and finally how you can have conversations with your compiler. One would never think one would want to do that, but the new compiler we're building at Rice, you can actually, chat with it, which is more we can say for the ones we've got. I will make my whole deck available. So, anyway, thanks. Great, and I'm sorry I made you wait this long.